That day began with a silent decision that had no grandiloquent announcement. Patricia got up before dawn, checked one last time the folder where she'd numbered receipts, account statements, and certified copies, and deliberately left the dining room table almost empty. The house had been less furnished for days because she'd sold a sideboard and 2 chairs as part of a test. She needed to see how her son would react when he realized the things didn't belong to him. At 8:10, the bank called to confirm receipt of her dispute over transactions she didn't recognize. Patricia made a note of the protocol number, wrote it down twice, and took a deep breath. There were no tears or trembling, just a clarity that at that age comes as a duty to herself. She knew Lawrence would show up to help and that he would bring papers. She, on the other hand, had facts, times, and backup copies, stored where even her neighbor Alice could attest to her lucidity. By mid-morning, when the light streamed in, through the window of the nearly bare living room, Patricia had already gone through 3 tasks any adult would do to protect themselves. She changed 2 passwords, checked her email for notifications of login attempts, and confirmed with the electric company that the account opened in her name at another address was under investigation. That single call gave her back a shred of control she'd been denying for months. She'd learned to speak without excuses or embellishment. I do not authorize. I do not recognize. I request an audit and preventive blocking. As the kettle simmered, she mentally reviewed the timeline. A card used for purchases she didn't make, a small loan she never took out, and her son's insistence on automating her salary. That day wasn't for drama, it was for organizing reality and putting a date on each piece. When Lawrence knocked on the door, he'd find a woman who, for the first time in a long time, no longer owed him explanations. At 11:30, the doorbell rang with the punctuality of someone who feels entitled. Patricia looked at the door for a few seconds before opening it. Lawrence was carrying a leather folder and the rehearsed gesture of someone who has come to solve something. There was no affectionate greeting or question about his mother. He walked straight in, placed the folder on the table, and began talking about the bank, her age, and the risks of managing the finances alone. Patricia listened silently, watching as her own son used a tone that mixed condescension with impatience, as if speaking to someone incapable of making decisions for themselves. When he mentioned the automatic transfer of his salary to her account, she nodded slightly, non-committal. Inside, however, she was mentally crossing out each sentence that confirmed what she already suspected. As he unfolded the papers, Patricia noticed he hadn't even taken the time to read them carefully. They were full-access forms, bank authorizations, and clauses that would leave her with no control over anything. Lawrence spoke quickly, with the confidence of someone who assumes he'll be obeyed. In his mind, he was still the son who knew everything, the one who paid for his studies thanks to his mother's sacrifice, and, paradoxically, believed he had the right to manage his life. Patricia, without raising her voice, simply asked him for a glass of water. She went to the kitchen, stood in front of the sink, and looked at her reflection in the window. A 62-year-old woman who had grown tired of being the one who forgave everything. In that reflection, she understood that this day would be the point of no return. Back at the table, Lawrence insisted it was all for his safety, using phrases that seemed straight out of an emotional manipulation manual. He said he'd seen cases of older adults being scammed, that he only wanted to spare him a scare. But every word was an excuse to disguise his control. Patricia watched him, and all the while noticed small details, the impatience in his breathing, the way his foot tapped the floor, the slight tremor in his right hand. It wasn't worry, it was anxiety. He was afraid of losing something he already considered his. Patricia remained silent, her silence signaling a distance he still didn't understand. When he finally stopped to look for his signature on the first page, Patricia asked for a minute. She stood up, walked slowly to her room, and took a blue folder out of the closet. She placed it on the table without saying anything. Inside were copies of the complaints, bank emails, dated account statements, and transactions she hadn't made. Lawrence looked at her in confusion, a mixture of bewilderment and annoyance. "What is this?" he asked. And that was when Patricia looked up for the first time in the entire conversation. There was no anger in her eyes, only determination. "This is my story, written with my own numbers," she thought, though she didn't say it out loud. That silence was more resounding than any scream. Lawrence fumbled through the papers, searching for something to refute the obvious. His voice grew higher, trying to regain the authority he felt he was losing. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that perhaps the bank had made a mistake, that she was confused. But Patricia didn't budge. She watched him calmly, resting one hand on the table, as if the gesture were her anchor. It was the first time she had seen him without the mask of exemplary son. There was fear in his eyes, a real fear of being discovered. Inside, Patricia felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. That truth, which hurt so much, also freed her. When Lawrence tried to regain control, his strategy immediately changed. He leaned closer, lowered his tone, and began using softer, almost patronizing language. "Mom, you're tired. This isn't what it seems," he repeated several times, as if softening his words could reverse the evidence. Patricia remained standing, holding the blue folder in her hands. The sound of the wall clock ticked like a countdown. Each tick was a reminder of how many years she had spent blindly trusting. At that moment she understood that loving a child doesn't mean giving them the power to destroy you. Lawrence, cornered by his mother's calm, decided to change the subject. He said his wife was also worried, that they both thought Patricia was no longer fit to handle financial matters. It was then that she realized the conversation was no coincidence. There was a plan. Every word, every unexpected visit, every insistence on helping her with the bank, it was all part of a strategy to render her voiceless. Patricia sat down, took a breath, and let him speak. The more he spoke, the more evident it became that he wasn't seeking to nurture, but to control. She didn't argue, didn't explain. She just listened. In her silence, there was a new strength that he still didn't know how to interpret. After almost an hour, Lawrence gathered, his papers with the tense expression of someone who feels something is slipping away. He said he would return when you're calmer, and left without looking back. Patricia closed the door, leaned her back against it, and let the weight of the moment settle over her. She didn't cry. She simply felt a kind of bitter peace, the kind that comes when a person realizes there's no turning back. She poured herself some cold coffee and sat down in front of the blue folder, reviewing every document, every number, every date. In that afternoon silence, she began to organize her next move. Because she was no longer a helpless mother. She was a woman gathering evidence of her own truth. The next few hours passed between calls and notes. Patricia contacted Attorney Sanchez again, who reminded her not to sign anything and that every interaction had to be recorded. Obediently and methodically, she jotted everything down in a notebook. Names, times, references. There was no improvisation, just almost surgical precision. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her life belonged to her again. Meanwhile, outside her home, the son she had so protected was beginning to construct his own version of events, one in which she appeared as a confused and difficult mother. But Patricia was no longer playing on that emotional terrain. She had decided to move her pieces quietly, without warning. At 6 in the evening, as the sun was setting, and the neighborhood was filled with the buzz of dinner parties and television, Patricia crossed the street to speak with Mrs. Alice, her trusted neighbor. She explained what was happening, showed copies, and asked if she could keep an identical folder in her closet. "Just in case something happens," she said without drama, like someone leaving an emotional testament. Alice moved, agreed without question. She knew Patricia wasn't an impulsive woman. When she returned home, Patricia paused in front of the hall mirror. She looked different, more assertive, less fearful. There was something in her gaze that mixed tiredness and dignity, as if she had finally recognized herself after years of invisibility. There was no rest that night. Patricia spent hours filing documents, highlighting each unauthorized transaction and sorting receipts by date. The sound of the fan filled the silence of the room as she mentally reviewed every detail. The charges from the electronics store, the electric bills in her name, but with someone else's. Address, the personal loan she never applied for. Every line was evidence of betrayal, but also a defense tool. There was no room for panic. With the precision that any auditor would have envied, Patricia transformed pain into method, anguish into strategy. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, Patricia slipped the last page into an envelope and sealed it with tape. On the cover, she wrote, "Lawrence M. Dossier." She left it by the door, ready to take to the lawyer's office in the morning. She poured herself some tea, looked out the window, and noticed the street was completely empty. She thought of all the years she had worked double shifts to pay for his college, of the forgotten birthdays, of the empty promises. That morning, she didn't feel like a victim, but rather a witness to her own awakening. She had crossed the point where unconditional love turns into self-destruction. Now, all that was left was to act. At dawn, Patricia dressed in simple clothes, tied her hair in a bun, and put the folder in her bag. She walked to the bank with firm steps without looking back. Along the way, she remembered the years when her life revolved around Lawrence, the early mornings preparing lunches, the night shifts at the factory, the times she lied to herself saying it was all worth it. That morning she realized that sacrifice doesn't guarantee gratitude, and that misunderstood love can become a prison. When she entered the bank, the guard greeted her kindly, little imagining that this petite woman was about to take the first step toward regaining her independence. At the teller window, she asked to speak to the manager and handed over the evidence of the suspicious transactions. The man, reviewing the documents, frowned. There were clear inconsistencies and several transactions from a different IP address. Patricia listened calmly, taking notes. "We'll open a new account for you, Ms. Mendes, and block the old one until the case is resolved," he said respectfully. Patricia nodded, not showing the emotion boiling inside. As she left the bank, she felt the cold air hit her face like a kind of blessing. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She had a plan. On her way home, Patricia stopped by Attorney Sanchez's office. She handed him the folder, and he complimented her on its precision. "This is more solid than many court reports," he said. Patricia smiled faintly, without vanity, because she knew that what sustained her wasn't pride, but necessity. While the attorney reviewed the documents, he explained that the evidence would allow her not only to recover the money, but also to prove that Lawrence had systematically misused her identity. "This could become a criminal case," he added. Patricia stared at the wall of the office, decorated with diplomas, and thought about how ironic it was to be there because of her own son. But she also thought that, for the first time, she wasn't alone. That afternoon, Lawrence called several times, but Patricia didn't answer. She let the answering machine record her voice, which sounded somewhere between angry and offended. Messages like, "I don't understand why you're doing this," or "You're overreacting," piled up. but she saved them as evidence. When night fell, she turned off the phone and sat down at the empty dining room table. She looked at the space where the sold furniture had once been and felt that its absence represented something deeper, the freedom to let go of what no longer serves a purpose. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, and in that silence, Patricia knew that every minute without answering was a form of resistance. The next day, the rumors began to spread. A neighbor told her she'd seen a social media post where Lawrence insinuated his mother was losing her mind and needed urgent help. Patricia didn't respond. She knew that gaslighting doesn't always begin with screaming, but with a manipulated version of events. She decided to print out the screenshots and add them to her file. Each public lie became another building block in her defense. Meanwhile, Sanchez advised her to remain calm, not interact, and let the truth build itself with time and evidence. And Patricia did so with the patience of someone who learned to survive through silence and perseverance. The following weeks were a mix of progress and minor setbacks. The banks confirmed that some purchases had been made from Lawrence's home, but others were still under review. Patricia used a separate folder for each case and updated the reports with dates and stamps. Her routine became a kind of mission. She no longer thought about punishing her son, but rather about protecting what remained of herself. Every time she signed a document or received a confirmation email, she felt as if she was slowly stitching up the cracks in her dignity. It was slow but steady work, and she did it with a serenity that many would find cold, but in reality was her new form of self-love. One Friday afternoon, Patricia received a call from the bank informing her that the investigation had concluded. Nearly $17,000 in unauthorized transactions, all linked to her son's account. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for her to feel the vertigo of confirmation. She wasn't surprised because she'd known it for a long time, but hearing the figure, hearing it spoken by an official voice, gave the truth a different weight. She hung up the phone, leaned against the counter, and took a deep breath. There were no tears, just a kind of dry relief, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to justify. That night, as she updated the folder with the new documents, Patricia looked at her watch and realized she hadn't moved for hours. If you're listening to this story this far, tell me where you're watching it from, because we all, at some point, trust someone who made us doubt ourselves. Then, she refocused, meticulously reviewing each sheet of paper. It wasn't about money anymore, but about identity. Each receipt was a part of her story that had been taken from her, and now she was getting it back. As the street lights went out one by one, Patricia felt something inside her also light up for the first time in a long time. The next morning, Patricia got up early and walked to the post office to send a certified copy of the entire file to her lawyer. She didn't trust email for something so delicate. While she waited her turn, she watched people coming and going with envelopes in hand, oblivious to her story. She thought about how many people carried similar burdens, betrayals, silences, debts that weren't just monetary, but of the soul. When the clerk stamped the envelope with the official postmark, she felt a strange, almost physical satisfaction. That simple action, sending a letter, became a symbol of something bigger, the decision to no longer remain silent. On her way back, she saw Lawrence's car parked in front of her house. Her heart leapt, but her step didn't falter. He was waiting for her at the door, arms crossed, trying to maintain his composure. "I just want to talk," he said, and Patricia let him in. Inside, the tension was thick, as if the air held weight. He began to justify himself, speaking quickly, mentioning bank errors, misunderstandings, money I was going to return. She listened, motionless. There was nothing new in his speech, just a string of excuses that were no longer effective. When he tried to approach, Patricia raised her hand and asked for distance. It was the first time in her life she had seen him back away. Lawrence changed tactics and began to raise his voice. He said she was destroying the family, that his wife was pressuring him, that everything had gotten out of hand. But Patricia no longer reacted to the noise. She watched him speak and thought only of how much she had allowed out of fear of losing him. She had accepted years of hurtful comments, of visits in which she felt like a servant in her own house, of ignored anniversaries. And now, when she finally set a boundary, he called it betrayal. The irony was as cruel as it was obvious. A mother's love had become the weapon he used to manipulate her. When Patricia showed him the bank document with the complete list of transfers, Lawrence was speechless. He read it, and every figure seemed to hit him in the face. He tried to deny it, then minimize it, and finally mumbled something about having done it out of necessity. But Patricia didn't respond. She just pointed at the door, her gesture so firm it brooked no argument. He left without looking back, and the sound of the door closing was like a release. Patricia sat down on the sofa and let the silence envelop her. There was no joy or sadness, just a peace so profound it hurt. It was the peace of someone who finally chooses herself. For the next few days, Patricia barely spoke about the matter. She focused on preparing the lawsuit with attorney Sanchez, who explained that the civil case could become a criminal case if Lawrence didn't agree to return the money. She listened without drama, signing each paper with a firm hand. This wasn't about revenge, but about respect. Each sealed document was a reaffirmation of her right to exist without fear. In the halls of the courthouse, others waited for their own lawsuits, but few knew that this grey-haired woman with a calm gaze was suing her own son. Patricia didn't feel ashamed. She felt relief. News of the case leaked out quickly. Some relatives wrote ambiguous messages asking if there wasn't another way, or suggesting that the family fixes things at home. Patricia didn't respond. She had spent a lifetime fixing things at home that others destroyed outside. Now, for the first time, she was letting the law do its work. Lawrence, on the other hand, began posting messages on social media, portraying herself as the victim of an unjust mother. The words were harsh, but Patricia refused to fall for them. She knew that whoever controls the narrative buys time, not the truth. And she already had proof, not stories. On the day of the first hearing, Patricia arrived with a calmness that disconcerted even her lawyer. She carried her neatly organized folder, wore a simple jacket, and wore her hair tied back. In the courtroom, Lawrence avoided looking at her. His once arrogant face showed signs of fatigue and guilt. When the judge reviewed the documents and listened to the arguments, the scales began to tip effortlessly. The evidence was overwhelming, and not even Lawrence's lawyers could sustain his defense. Patricia felt no pleasure in seeing him cornered, only a serene melancholy, like someone witnessing the fall of a dream that had once been love. As she left the courtroom, Attorney Sanchez informed her that the other side wanted a settlement to prevent the case from becoming public. Patricia thought for a few seconds and nodded. She didn't need punishment, just justice and distance. Days later, the agreement was signed. Full repayment of the $17,000, an additional $5,000 for damages and costs, and a public statement from Lawrence acknowledging the fraud. When she finished signing, Patricia looked at the attorney and smiled slightly. "You see," she said calmly, "sometimes silence is the best strategy." Then she walked out of the building slowly, but surely like someone finally freed from the heaviest burden of their life. Lawrence's statement appeared on her social media 2 days later. It was brief, almost impersonal, but sufficient. She acknowledged having misused her mother's identity and publicly apologized. The comments were divided between disbelief and sympathy, but Patricia didn't read them. She didn't need anyone's validation. While the scandal unfolded, she remained silent, tending her garden and organizing her papers with the meticulousness that had accompanied her throughout her life. Each new morning was a blank page, with no room for guilt. What had once bound her now became a lesson, and that was enough. With the money recovered and her savings protected in the new account, Patricia decided to fulfill a long-delayed dream, moving near the ocean. She found a simple little house in a small coastal town with a wooden porch and a garden that begged for careful attention. She sold the old home without looking back. When she arrived at the new place, the sound of the ocean greeted her like a silent song, one that promised nothing but offered peace. That night, as she unpacked, she paused in front of the window and thought that, after so long, she finally lived in a place where everything inside truly belonged to her. The first few days on the coast were peaceful. Patricia walked along the shore at dawn, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the sun touch the water and make it sparkle. At the local market, she was already known for her friendly greetings and the calm way she chose fruit. Every daily gesture became a small ceremony of freedom. There were no awkward phone calls, no envelopes with other people's debts, no manipulative messages. Only the sound of the sea, reminding her that life, even after pain, can still have rhythm and beauty. It was a peace earned, not given. One afternoon, she received a letter from the lawyer confirming that Lawrence had made all the payments under the agreement. The words "case closed" were underlined on the last page. Patricia read it slowly, folded the paper carefully, and put it in a box with the most important documents of her life. She felt neither euphoria nor sadness, only a profound sense of closure. That envelope symbolized the end of one phase and the beginning of another, where she wouldn't have to prove anything to anyone. Outside, the wind rustled the curtains, and the scent of the sea wafted into the house like a promise of calm. As the weeks passed, Patricia began to fill her routine with simple things: tending the plants, reading on the terrace, writing lists of memories she wanted to keep, and others she'd rather let go. Every afternoon, while watering the garden, she thought about how much she had learned about boundaries, even with those she loves most. She had understood that love without respect isn't love, but dependence in disguise. Sometimes it takes a while for the heart to understand what reason silently screams. But when it finally accepts it, everything falls into place with a clarity that is both frightening and soothing. One day, while organizing a bookshelf, she found an old photograph of Lawrence as a child, with a toothless grin and a blue balloon in his hand. She looked at it for a long time, without rancor. She placed it in a small frame and left it on a shelf, not as a tribute, but as a testament. She couldn't erase the past, but she could choose how to remember it. Instead of bitterness, she felt gratitude for having survived it all, for having found, even after so much pain, the strength to start over without losing her essence. In that serenity, there was a silent victory. Over time, Patricia became a beloved figure in her new neighborhood. She helped older women understand their accounts, taught them how to review their bank statements, and how to recognize signs of financial manipulation. "It's not distrust, it's caution," she would tell them. Her experience became a tool to help others avoid the same thing. Every time she shared her story, she saw the spark of recognition in someone's eyes, that gesture of someone who had once been underestimated. Patricia wasn't looking for admiration. She was looking to convey autonomy, the kind of power that doesn't need fanfare to be real. One morning, she was invited to a small community meeting at the local library to talk about financial security and family relationships. She accepted somewhat shyly, but when she began to speak, the words came out on their own. She shared how abuse can be disguised as caring, how control can be disguised as concern. Several people listened with tears in their eyes. When she finished, the audience applauded silently, respectfully. Patricia smiled, knowing that her story, born of pain, was now serving to protect others. The following months brought a different, more solid calm. Patricia no longer needed to talk about the past to feel free. She simply looked at her, present. On the terrace, she watched the children play, listened to the waves crash against the rocks, and felt that, finally, her life had a rhythm that didn't depend on anyone else. She had achieved something that can't be measured in money. The peace of not fearing the phone, of not expecting apologies, of not justifying the unjustifiable. It was a simple but honest life. Each sunrise was a reminder that surviving is also a form of success. One Sunday afternoon, she decided to write a letter, not to send it, but to close a cycle. In it, she thanked her past self for not having given up on life and giving her another chance. She asked for forgiveness for the times she blamed herself for loving too much, for believing that being a mother meant forgetting about herself. She put the letter in a drawer next to her diary and covered it with a sea stone she had found on her first walk on the beach. In that simple gesture, Patricia sealed an intimate pact. She would never again allow love to make her invisible. One summer afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of salt, Patricia received an unexpected visitor. It was Mrs. Alice, who had travelled from her old town to see her. They hugged for a long time, with the tenderness of those who shared an important secret. They drank tea on the porch and talked about the past as if it was someone else's story, something that no longer hurt. Alice returned the folder she had kept all that time, untouched, and Patricia received it like someone closing a circle. "I don't need it anymore," she said with a smile, and it was true. That folder was no longer a defense, but a reminder of what she had overcome. After saying goodbye, Patricia walked to the beach and sat on the damp sand. She watched the waves crash again and again with the same insistence with which life strikes, but also teaches. She thought of Lawrence, of the distance that separated them, and understood that some wounds heal not with forgiveness, but with absence. She didn't want revenge or reconciliation, only peace. She closed her eyes and listened to her own breathing in time with the sea. In that moment she felt light, as if the weight of years dissolved with each slowly receding wave. Autumn arrived with its fresh air and the first colors in the trees. Patricia decorated the porch with dried flowers and wrote in her notebook some reflections on what she had learned. She said that independence doesn't always begin with a shout, but with a stop, spoken in a low but firm voice. She also noted that sometimes justice doesn't fix everything, but it clears the way for a new beginning without fear. Rereading her words, she smiled serenely. In her own way, she had turned her experience into a guide for those who hadn't yet dared to take the first step. One afternoon, while walking along the coast, she came across a group of young volunteers collecting trash from the beach. One of them, recognizing her from the community talks, asked for a photo and thanked her for giving courage to silent mothers. Patricia was surprised but humbly accepted. She didn't see herself as a hero, just as someone who decided to stop lying to herself. That night, as she returned home, she looked at the photo on her phone and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride, not for what she had endured, but for having been able to stop the cycle before it destroyed her. That night it rained heavily, and the sound of it hitting the roof made her think, about everything that had changed. She remembered the day Lawrence arrived with those papers, the tension, the fear. But instead of pain, she felt gratitude. Every difficult step had led her to this peaceful present. The house smelled of coffee and damp wood, and the radio played an old song her mother liked. Patricia closed her eyes and thought that maybe life, after all, knew how to balance things out. It had taken so much from her for years, but in the end, it had given her back herself. Next morning, she got up early and made homemade bread. While the dough rested, she opened the window to let in the salty sea air. She felt alive, with a kind of happiness that needed no witnesses. On her table, there were no longer any folders or envelopes with documents, just a cup of tea and an open notebook. She wrote a sentence on the first page. Freedom is also inherited when someone dares to break the silence. If you've made it this far, I want to know where you're listening to me from, and if you've ever had to start from scratch with a tired but peaceful heart. She closed the notebook, took a sip of tea, and let the sea complete the rest of the thought. As the months passed, Patricia felt she no longer needed to look back to remember where she came from. She had transformed the wound into experience and the fear into purpose. In the small garden of her house by the sea, the flowers grew with a vitality that seemed to reflect her own rebirth. Sometimes, at dusk, she would sit on the porch gazing at the horizon, with the same serenity of someone who had survived a storm and learned to enjoy the silence after the thunder. Her story was no longer a burden, but a beacon illuminating her new beginning. One night, as the sky turned orange and the sound of the waves marked a slow rhythm, Patricia opened her notebook for the last time. Without thinking too much, she wrote, "I didn't lose a child. I recovered the woman I was before I was afraid." She smiled, closed the notebook, and leaned back in the rocking chair, letting the sea breeze caress her face. That phrase, spoken calmly, seemed to float in the air like a silent invitation to all those who, like her, have learned that self-love can also be a form of faith. Winter arrived gently, with cool winds and pink sky afternoons. Patricia had learned to enjoy routine without feeling empty. She cooked for herself, listened to classical music, and tended her garden as if each plant were a promise fulfilled. Sometimes she received letters from women who had heard her story and shared their own. Some expressed their gratitude for her courage, others simply needed someone to understand. Patricia responded to each one with simple words, without grandiloquent advice. She simply said, "You are not alone, and it's never too late to start taking care of yourself." It was her way of closing the circle with tenderness and truth. A year after the trial, Patricia walked along the beach at dawn. The wind blew hard, but she didn't care. She thought about everything she had been through, how far she had come since that day her son tried to take over her life. There was no more resentment, no more sadness, only one certainty, that her story, so human and painful, had ended in peace. As the sun rose over the horizon, she smiled and whispered to herself, "I did it." She didn't need applause, no forgiveness, just the sound of the ocean accompanying her silence. And in that moment, Patricia Mendes knew she was finally free.